Notebook 9 Towards the Hell of Verdun. From the 29th of February 1916 to the 26th of April 1916. Part 2. On the last episode, we saw how the poilus suffered their stay in the Bois de la Folie sector. They suffered blizzards and downpours with barely a shelter to protect them, and during that time Captain Croix-Meyreville and Commandant Kansgram punished many men. Among those victims was Barthas, who, for refusing to send his men to work in daylight in sight of a German machine gun, was demoted to a mere private and transferred to the 15th Company, being forced to leave his friends behind. Simultaneous with this, the soldiers received worrying news of a terrible battle raging in Verdun, together with news that they would be relieved from the Bois de la Folie sector by the English, to be sent to some new, undisclosed location. Hardly reconforting. Now we continue with their story. On the 8th of March, the regiment was finally fully relieved by the English. The poilus left the town of Besançon and encamped in a town called Magnicourt. The next day they had another long and painful march and installed themselves in the town of Contville. Barthas wrote that evening there he had a small incident. He entered a small house with its doors wide open and which seemed completely abandoned, when he suddenly saw a human body stretched out on the ground, dressed with only a few miserable rags. The body was not moving. Worried, he quickly approached it, but upon closer inspection saw it was only a plaster statue dressed as a beggar. He soon discovered a door that led to a small chapel, and an inscription that said that this had been the hovel of Saint Benedict, who lived and died in piety there. Barthas wrote that the Pas de Calais had enough shrines dedicated to different saints that it seemed half of the inhabitants of paradise came from there. After that, the next day, the regiment departed on a 23-kilometer march until they reached the town of Incourt, and again the next day they had to march and sleep in the field with only their tent cloths as shelter. Finally, on March 12th, they were told this would be the last day of marching, but it would be a very difficult one, so much so that they removed 2 packs from each squad, so that by turns 2 soldiers could march without the heavy burden. On the way they passed a town with a monument to the famous Battle of Crécy in the 100 Years' War, where Edward III of England defeated the army of Philip VI of France. A battle that in the new modern war the poilus were fighting would barely have qualified as a skirmish or a raid. Finally, at 3 in the afternoon, they reached the village of Le Titre, their destination, though 3 days later they were moved again to the neighboring town of Motte-Boulez. The squad Barthas was in was lucky enough to be lodged in the barn of good farm folk, who also ran a tavern. They let the poilus use their tables and chairs to eat their meals, and the soft bed of straw was a blessing for the soldiers. Soon after arriving, the poilus were put through long and exhausting exercises and drills, no doubt by order of their commandant. One day they were surprised in the middle of their exercises by the arrival of their colonel. The colonel asked the lieutenant in charge how many hours of drilling the men were doing. The lieutenant replied as if scared that it was not enough. 8 hours, sir, with 10 minutes of rest each hour. The colonel was horrified by this, and ordered that there be less drilling and more rest. And so, from that day on, the soldiers' rest minutes would be 10 minutes longer, and they still drilled for 8 hours. It was almost mockery. After that, during one of their nights in that town, the squad was sleeping in their barn when Barthas was awakened by the sound of the door opening. It turned out to be the landlord with a lamp in his hand. Barthas asked what was the matter, and the farmer said he needed 2 of them to lend him a hand. Immediately, Barthas got up and shook his neighbor awake. This neighbor was a man called Galin, and Barthas wrote that if he was not a priest, then he was training to become one. He was full of religious devotion, and he barely interacted with the other poilus, instead spending his free time with the battalion's curates, monks, and seminarians. It turned out the farmer needed their help with a cow that was having difficulty calving. Both poilus admitted to their inexperience on the matter, but the farmer said their task couldn't be easier, and so they went to help. The calf had gotten his rear legs and hindquarters out, but the rest was stuck. The farmer tied a rope to the calf's legs and asked Barthas and Galin to pull on it while he took care of the cow. Barthas wrote that the work required dexterity and coordination which the two of them lacked, as one did not become a midwife of cattle in one day. He wrote that despite their best intentions, they must have pulled too hard, because when the calf finally got out, it was in a miserable shape. The farmers gave him a swig of warm rum, cleaned him, and rolled him into a basket of soft straw, but the little animal died almost immediately. The good folk still wanted to thank the two poilus for their help, and offered them some wine. Barthas accepted gladly, but Galin refused. Thinking he did not like wine, they offered him some rum, but the poilu refused this as well. The farmers were very confused, but, after Galin left, Barthas explained that the soldier was a priest, and the next day, being Sunday, the day of communion, and it already being past midnight, he couldn't risk his soul by swallowing even a drop of water. Barthas wrote the farmers were shocked to learn that they had asked a clergyman to help their cow in giving birth, and felt some remorse at having tempted a minister of God and placing him at risk of mortal sin. After that, one evening, the poilus were eating when their section chief suddenly appeared and announced the division would depart at 6 the next morning. The poilus lost all appetite and filled with worry. They knew that in all likelihood they would be sent to the raging battle of Verdun, whose name alone chilled their blood. Already, all home leaves had been suspended since they had left Saint-Éloi. As the column marched on the road, the poilus anxiously strained to see where they were headed. The road forked in one direction to the town of Noyelles-sur-Mer, and in another direction to the plains of Ponthieu. If they headed to Noyelles, it meant they would go to Verdun. Finally, the column approached the fork in the road, and then turned in the direction of the plains, giving its back to Noyelles. With this, all of the soldiers breathed a sigh of relief, and soon songs, laughter, and happy conversation spread through the ranks. They did not care where they were going, as long as it was not Verdun. Finally, their battalion was billeted at the town of Favier, on the shores of the English Channel and near the mouth of the Somme. At low tide, hundreds of soldiers went to the beaches to fish for shellfish and shrimps in the sand. Everything was quite lively. They also had to carry out a long march for exercise. Still, no one knew why they had come to this town, and after 3 days, without explanation, they marched again back to Motte-Boulez on April 3rd. That day the heat was oppressive, and the march took place on the hottest hours of the day. Hundreds of men fell behind and stopped for rest under the shades of trees. When the battalion arrived at their destination, the officers asked for a list of the men who hadn't been able to keep up, to create a category of slackers who had to be watched. Some thought being on that list meant that they would get a lighter load in the next march, or more rest, and several who did not fall behind lied to get into the list. But the next day, they were informed that those on the list evidently needed more training, and until further notice they would go to drills in full campaign gear, while the others did not have to carry their packs. And so, for once, the tricksters were tricked. Barthas wrote that the long time they spent in the village of La Motte created deep bonds between the Poilus and the inhabitants, especially with the ladies. Relationships and amorous adventures were tied and untied. Barthas wrote that he, being a loving and faithful husband, did not get involved in any of this. Instead, he became friends with an old couple that lived in a shack at the far end of the village. Barthas had been returning from one of the useless guard duties when he saw them. A poor old lady of 65 who worked alone, spending what little strength she had trying to prepare her bits of fields and a garden which was full of weeds. Her husband was consumed by age and rheumatism and couldn't get out of his sick bed. So, one day during one of his breaks, Barthas picked up a tool and went to work on the old lady's garden. The lady was worried. "But, young man," she said, "you're working for nothing. I am too poor to pay you anything." Barthas told her not to worry. He would stop by every day when off duty to help until her garden was in good shape and all the potatoes were planted. And so, 4 or 5 days later, the work was done. The old woman did not know how to express her thanks and picked out the best apples in her cupboard for him, and Barthas had to accept an offer from the couple for coffee one evening. And so the three of them had their small party in the old man's sick room. The old lady showed him a portrait of her when she was 20 years old, and the couple talked about when they were young. They had been about to get married when the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 broke out, and the young man was drafted into the militia. When peace was signed, he immediately hurried back to the town to find his fiancée, but the Prussians were still occupying the region. So the marriage was postponed, and the man went every day to his fiancée's house and stayed there helping her from morning to evening. One day they were having a nice conversation when a rude Prussian Unteroffizier burst in, claiming that he needed some information, though in reality he only wished to harass the two lovers, going to the point of trying to kiss the young woman right in front of her fiancé. Recalling those distant memories, the old lady turned red with indignation, as if she was living it right there and then. Before this insult, the young man had to defend their honor, and he slapped the Prussian on both cheeks. At this, the non-com quickly fled, but soon returned with a squad of policemen, who arrested the man, gave him a beating, and dragged him off to jail. The commander of the Prussian garrison was a captain who was feared for his brutal discipline, and he decided to make an example of the man. For daring to strike a Prussian non-com, he would be shot the very next day. Luckily, it turned out this captain was billeted at the house of the town's mayor, who told him exactly what had happened. The terrified young girl was summoned before the officer, and she gave her account. There also appeared the rude non-com, who had to admit to his misdeeds. And so, the next day, the young man was released and saved from being shot. 3 days later, the Prussians left the village for good. The two young lovers got married, loved each other, and had many children, who were now either dead or living far away. Time had passed, and they remained in that poor shack in La Motte that was their home. Only death would take them away. And that was their story. After that, one day, Barthas decided to try and see the colonel to protest about the unfair punishment he had been dealt by Captain Croix-Meyreville. He submitted his request for a hearing at his company's office. He waited patiently for a week, then resubmitted his request. The next day, he was summoned by an angry Commandant Kanzgram. "Why do you want to talk with the colonel?" he asked. "Commandant, sir, it is about my punishment," replied Barthas. "You know full well that if Captain Croix has punished you, he had good reason to do so." "That is not my opinion, sir." "So you're going to persist on this?" "Yes, Commandant, sir." "You know, I won't support your request for a hearing." "Commandant, I'm sorry, but I will persist all the same." And so the commandant dismissed him. Barthas asked if he could go to the colonel right away, but the commandant said that that was out of the question. He would have to wait until the colonel summoned him. 3 days later, Barthas received a note which read, "Corporal Barthas will be presented to me when I visit the encampment at La Motte-Boulez." In fact, the colonel went through there, but he did not summon him. Barthas was confused, but soon discovered what had happened. The captain and the commandant, afraid that his protests would bring them trouble, had intercepted his request and forged a reply to make Barthas wait until he lost heart due to repeated letdowns and finally gave up. The cowardly and lying actions of these two officers was beyond contemptible. Barthas finally decided to write directly to the colonel, specifying that he was going outside the prescribed procedures because he had not been able to reach him through regular channels. Things moved very quickly after that. That very evening, Barthas was informed by his lieutenant that he would present himself to the colonel the next morning. And so, on the 10th of April, after waiting for an hour, Barthas, accompanied with his lieutenant, entered the colonel's chateau. As they walked, the servants and orderlies looked at Barthas's muddy clothes with visible disdain. Soon after, Barthas stood like an accused man before Colonel Duz himself. "What are you asking for?" he said in a rough voice. Barthas told him of his complaints against his punishment and handed him his written appeal. The colonel read it fully, stood in silence for a moment, and then said, "Nevertheless, according to your commandant and your captain, you're a pretty lousy soldier." Barthas replied, "Colonel, sir, I have no punishments on my record, neither during my 3 years of military service nor during this campaign. And as I have spelled out in that paper, I've done my duty in every situation, and I can, if you wish, give you statements from irrefutable eyewitnesses. If I refused an order that Captain Crow gave me, the whole company will attest that following that order would have uselessly exposed the men to certain death by making them work in daylight in a trench enfiladed by enemy machine guns." The colonel thought for a moment, inquired a little more, and then dismissed Barthas, staying with the lieutenant to discuss Barthas's fate. That same day, in the afternoon, Barthas was with his company carrying out an exercise in a field. His section was deployed as skirmishers hiding in the tall grass, when they spotted the colonel and Commandant Kansgram riding towards the company. Kansgram looked completely exhausted. Normally he seemed to have great difficulty keeping his balance on his horse, but this time it was truly laughable. He made the most comical efforts trying to cling to his nag, while it struggled to keep up with the colonel's horse. As they approached, it became clear that they were in the middle of a heated discussion. Finally, they came close enough for the commandant's words to be heard, and proved that Barthas was the subject of the conversation. "You know, Colonel, sir, this corporal has very extreme socialist ideas." But at that moment, the two officers spotted the soldiers, and the surprised colonel abruptly changed the subject. The next day, Barthas learned from the colonel's aide, a comrade who was later killed in Verdun, that the colonel lectured both the commandant and the captain harshly. Above all, he was furious that they had blocked Barthas' request for a hearing, and he ordered them to restore his rank at the next promotion ceremony. Barthas wrote that the rank meant little to him, but he was happy with the bad luck he had caused the two hated officers. Still, this did not keep Captain Croix-Meyreville from being promoted to Captain Adjutant Major soon after. Barthas wrote that the rank of Captain Adjutant Major had been a useless position with useless functions. It had been abolished by a superior officer less stupid than the others, but now it had been reinstated. The news of the captain's promotion brought great joy to the 21st Company, Barthas's old company. The men were joyous, screaming in Occitan, "No more Kronprinz! Four-Ice is gone!" If I haven't mentioned it before, they called Captain Croix-Meyreville Kronprinz, or Crown Prince in German, because with his petty despotism he would have made the Germans proud at how he harmed his fellow Frenchmen. Anyway, the 21st Company was happy, but the rest of the battalion, including Barthas, was worried. With his new rank, Croix-Meyreville would now enforce his petty tyranny over all of them. The daily assembly the next few days consisted of nothing but orders, threats, prohibitions, and punishments. The now Captain Adjutant Major established his lair in the town's hall. Every day, from daybreak, he would emerge from there dressed in his English get-up. The first thing he did was pay a visit to the prisoners locked in the firehouse, where he counted and recounted them with meticulous care. After that, he would go out with his chronometer in hand to verify departures, assemblies, work details, and exercises, among others. Each day he made a whole company sweep and clean the streets until the exact hour the work detail was meant to be carried out. A few overlooked dry leaves or a bit of litter were enough to make him furious. At noon he would summon all the sergeants and corporals, fix his thick glasses on a book as thick as the Old Testament, and interrogate them on the most obscure aspects of military theory. And still this was not all. In the evenings he would sneak up on the sentinels guarding the exits to the village or the police posts. He would bust into taverns and scour the billets for any slight violation of the regulations. He would pursue petty thieves, those who were quenching their thirst outside authorized hours, and send back to their quarters those who were walking around in an outfit that was different from the one authorized for that specific hour. And he created groups of non-coms that patrolled the streets to enforce these rules. It was all beyond absurd and infuriating. One day, Barthas wrote they were in a very long and exhausting exercise in the forest when he overheard a fight between Captain Croix-Meyreville and Lieutenant Cordier of the 14th Company. "I gave you this order," said the captain. "No, you didn't. You're lying," replied the lieutenant. "Watch your tongue," said the angry captain. To this, the lieutenant simply replied, "What, watch my tongue? Watch how I knock your glasses off your nose." The captain was extremely fond of his thick glasses, and immediately rode away in panic as fast as he could, to the great joy of all the poilus who watched. Later, on April 15th, the regiment had to leave the town and go to Noyelles-sur-Mer, where they embarked onto railway cars at 7 in the evening, piled so tightly that they couldn't stretch their legs. The destination was secret, but they all felt that they were being sent to Verdun, and the mood was grim. Some still clung to vague hopes that they might be sent to the Oise or to Champagne, but the train passed several places and still headed east. At 4 p.m. the next day, the train arrived at the station of Vitry-le-François, and there were two paths ahead of it. If the train turned, they would be heading to Champagne, but if it kept going east, then there could be no doubt that Verdun was their final destination. Alas, the train did not turn. They were being sent to the hell of Verdun. They disembarked at the once pretty town of Revigny, now half demolished. After 24 hours of immobility, they were ordered to march 12 kilometers to a place where they would encamp that night. The sky was clear, and by the North Star the poilus saw that they were giving their backs to Verdun. What it meant they did not know. As they passed a little village, they received the order to be at attention. The general himself was watching their regiment parade by. As Barthas passed close to him, he saw the general stamp his foot and exclaim, "But these men are sleeping! Will you look at that?" But that was easy for the general to say. He had traveled comfortably in first class instead of piled like cattle, and then he had traveled by car instead of marching those kilometers with all of a soldier's gear weighing him down. They finally arrived at a little village called Villers-le-Sec, just as a storm broke out. The half-demolished shed where Barthas' section was billeted offered little protection against the rain, and the rain continued the entirety of the next day. The day after that, April 17th, they rested because the following day they would begin their approach to Verdun. During those days, Barthas talked with the locals and discovered that the Germans had occupied the village for a few days during the beginning of the war, though they did not commit any serious crimes. The wife of the farmer with whom Barthas was billeted did not stop complaining that a German cavalryman had threatened her with his revolver. The German had discovered some chocolate, sugar, and a few other sweets under the good woman's bed, and had wanted to confiscate them. But the woman protested so vigorously that the German, who turned out to not be so ferocious, simply left. Barthas wrote that he knew some Frenchmen who, if they'd been in Germany in a similar situation, would have had fewer scruples, and would have taken possession of the chocolate under the bed without hesitation, and of the woman too, if she'd been young and pretty. After hearing that story, Barthas was walking down the town street when he saw a crowd gathering in a field around a brownish, greasy mass from which emerged pieces of bone. Someone explained to him that in August 1914 there were terrible battles in that region, and after it the Germans, who had been the victors, gathered all the corpses, both German and French, doused them in gasoline, and set them alight. The horrible stench lasted days and could be perceived from miles away. No one knew how, but the shape before them was a remnant of that sinister bonfire of over a year and a half ago. After that, on April 18th, the poilus left the town as heavy rain fell. Each man protected himself as best he could. Most had English raincoats, which the Tommies had traded them. Others improvised hoods with tent cloths. Then, all of a sudden, and right when the rain fell the heaviest, an unbelievable order came down the line. They were being ordered to remove their raincoats. This order came from Captain Adjutant Major Croix-Meireville himself, who had just recalled with perfect timing that a circular from a few days ago forbid the wearing of raincoats that were not of the color blue. This was the captain's way of getting his petty revenge on Lieutenant Cordier for scaring him in the forest, as the lieutenant had equipped all his company in khaki-colored raincoats. It was very easy for the Crown Prince to let 1,000 men get soaked to the bone for his petty vengeance. He rode by, wrapped in his blue raincoat, and pitilessly ordering the men to remove their only protection against the elements. At noon, they arrived at the village of Neuvert-aux-Courts, where they had to wait for a long time under the rain as room was made for them. The village was full of hundreds of slackers and signalmen who had been in that village for over a year. These men watched over piles of telegraph poles and telephone wires to be installed when they finally conquered enemy territory. Meanwhile, their only preoccupations were fishing in the river, carving on artillery shell caps, and flirting with the ladies of the town. Barthas was lodged together with 30 men in the ruined attic of an old house, inhabited by a poor woman with 7 or 8 children. The poilus got no straw, and the floor threatened to collapse at any moment, so the night was not pleasant. Later, Barthas explored the town. He discovered that a small skirmish had taken place in the town in 1914, and there were a few small French and German graves in the cemetery. The soldiers expected to be sent to Verdun at any moment, but no orders came for 2 days. The third day they were sent in the afternoon for field exercises, despite the threat of a storm. The ground was muddy and flooded, but still the soldiers had to march several kilometers and carry the exercises out. The lieutenant in command only stopped the exercises when the first raindrops started falling. This made it so the Poilus had to march the kilometers back to the village under heavy rain and sleet. They finally reached the first houses of Noyer and were looking forward to a roof under their heads when there appeared the Crown Prince himself, Captain Adjutant Major Croix-Meyreville. A groan spread through the ranks. The slimy man was absolutely ecstatic. He announced what for him were sensational news. It turned out that military headquarters had decided that, from now on, the soldiers could march in columns of 3, instead of only 4, 2, or single file, and he wanted to try it out immediately. Under orders from the lieutenants, the Poilus did a left face and then turned right and marched by 3s, executing the simple move perfectly. The captain was completely dumbfounded and beaming. He made them repeat the maneuver several times under the rainstorm, before finally leaving them to return to their billets, completely exhausted. Later, on April 25th, the Poilus carried out a march which sent them through the village of Sommeil, which was completely burned down and devastated. The newspapers had said that in 1914 the Germans had been exasperated by the resistance of a tiny rearguard unit and had burned down the village, massacred the population, and committed many terrible atrocities. But Barthas said that the inhabitants of the region whom he asked could not give him any precise information on the subject. As they passed the village, he saw to his astonishment that the people had built small wooden houses amid the ruins, painted in bright colors and full of climbing flowers. He heard the song of a young girl, the laughter of a child, the barks of a dog, and the mooing of a cow. The town of Sommeil was emerging from its own ashes. The next day, the soldiers headed out in a march under a very strong sun that made the kilometers seem endless. Still, they passed a beautiful landscape with small villages, green prairies, ravines, and springs of clear water. But it was not to admire the beauty of the landscape that the Poilus had come here. While they traveled, many men collapsed by the road from exhaustion, and the Crown Prince mistreated them pitilessly. In such a fashion, Barthas and the other Poilus, at the very limits of their exhaustion, reached the objective of the day's march, the town of Condé-en-Barrois, on their way to Verdun. And here we reach the end of the 9th notebook. There is not much to say about it. The soldiers worked and suffered. Barthas managed to regain his rank, though not his company, and now Croix-Meyreville has become Captain Adjutant Major, exercising his tyranny over the whole battalion. And the soldiers are going to Verdun, a name that barely needs an introduction, one of the longest and bloodiest battles in human history. We shall see how it goes for Barthas and his comrades in that terrible battle, but one thing is certain. There will be a lot of suffering and bloodshed, with no real purpose or gains. I will see you on the next episode, and until then, I hope you all have a good day.